All right, here. So we're gonna switch now to focus on South America, Latin American independence, and the big thing that we started with when we looked at the beginning of independence in North America, particularly on the East Coast, where we would eventually get the formation of the United States. South and Latin America is a little bit different because we have some very unique and different areas around this large, continent, and then into the Caribbean and islands. But the focus is really kind of in the same area of looking at social norms, economic norms, and political norms. All right. So the first thing to look at is society. All right. And one of the things that we talked about was kind of how in what would be the American colonies, you had this kind of unique division between the people who were loyal to the British, but they never really made the same kind of social structure versus kind of what became in society where there were actual names for the difference between the European-born Spanish colonists and the American-born Spanish colonists. There wasn't really a very clear-cut example of that in North America. When we talked about like the Washingtons, the Jeffersons versus the Thomas Paines, right? There really is no like name for Thomas Paine who wants this freedom. And there's no real difference between he and like a George Washington. When we look at a lot of the Latin and South American divisions, there's this clear division between the Peninsulare and the Creoles. And the Creoles become the people who are ultimately the drivers of independence in South and Central America. And then in some of the Caribbean countries. Yes, sir.
Do the Creoles have anything to do with the spice called Creole?
Yes, probably. I mean, Creole was kind of a name for the European ethnic link to Europe and the Iberian Peninsula in Spain. So it probably, but it also was kind of this identification of American. These are Americans. And so they're the wealthy landowning white Europeans of Spanish descent, but ultimately, they're going to be the ones who want to gain some sort of social and political autonomy because they're not getting that. The Peninsulares are the ones who control the government. So they literally still live in the Iberian Peninsula, but they would come to the colonies and they would hold the government offices. And what's kind of interesting is that if you look at South American societies today, a lot of the problems that occur in their government are because of some of these divisions. And it gets to the point where, like, if you even look at, like, Mexico or Colombia, some of the bigger Latin American, South American countries, you can see the differences that still exist racially. Even though we may not really think about a lot of the racial division, you will see that the people who are often in, like, higher level political office or economic standing, they're much lighter skinned. And that's because they typically are coming from this old world of that peninsular or Creole European heritage. And they've, for centuries, maintained a lot of that social and political control. All right? And that's why, like, they still even talk about today, especially like Mexico, is still a very nationalistic country with a lot of very strong federal power. And that's all directly linked to some of these old Creole families that have kind of controlled a lot of, especially the rural areas, and give a lot of their power to kind of that federal authority. Now, the other part of that is, though, the similarity is that they still have kind of this class of people based off of, race, but then also kind of the heritage of the indigenous people. And so the names given for people who were native were the Amerindians, or they often referred to them as the Castas, who would be people with, or mestizo, mixed native and European blood. And what started to happen in a lot of the South American countries and Latin American is that the Spanish heritage was for assimilation. And so you get a real kind of clear breakdown of a lot of the native groups throughout Central and South America. And if you've studied, back in elementary and middle school, the largest empires in North and South America were the Native American empires of like the Aztecs, the Incas, the Mayans. Well, eventually the Spanish culture kind of breaks down those different groups to the point where their culture almost disappears in many areas. And so there isn't like this collective group of people that are in conflict with the governments that start to form as independence flourishes. Whereas in the United States, you have this constant conflict as the Americans start heading westward. You don't see as much of that in South and Central America. Then there's also Black Americans, because slavery was brought to parts of Central and South America, particularly the Caribbean. That's where it started. Eventually, we're going to talk, probably not until about December, we're going to focus on Brazil and Haiti, which have these very extreme levels of slavery that exist. And in one case, in Haiti, their independence is directly linked to a slave revolution that occurs. And then women, still kind of interestingly enough, are very comparative in the independence movements of being very much at the bottom and not really being included. Typically, they were all part of the labor class. And so they played a role. And what's interesting is that the Creoles, in very similar fashion to what we kind of looked at with the relationship between slavery and the rhetoric in the colonies in North America, they're going to be needed as part of the process of gaining this independence, because they make the masses, and they're going to be required for fighting a lot of these acts of independence. All right, so then the next part of this is going to look at society or economy. There's some similarities that you can draw through a lot of the economics in South America and the Caribbean. A big part of that is that it's very agricultural based. However, there's a much more extreme level of commodities. And to say commodities, that means like products, particularly like gold and silver. And if you remember way back when, that was like the thing they teach you about Spanish colonization. Their focus was on gaining those types of products. The thing that becomes very unique in all areas of South America and Central America, and then even in places like Haiti, the Dominican, Jamaica, Cuba, is that they were very much part of these things called haciendas. And this will be a big part of when we get into some of the independence aspects of South America, is that there's a lot of sectional type of control. And a lot of that comes from the large landowners who had these big kind of security forces become a major player in kind of the political regime change. And they eventually, in many cases, topple governments. They pretty much kind of established this very big way that their governments are more focused on those who control the land and the agriculture and the products that are being created, rather than any sort of democratic freedoms. You can draw a lot of kind of comparisons to this to the Americas, the United States as well, because the idea of slavery, which is all going to lead to a civil war, is all over this, and the idea of plantation slavery and the cotton. South and Central America, they're all created for the same economic reasons. And so when independence comes, they're all going to have similar factions that create this movement towards independence. And when they're trying to kind of argue over who should control, this is going to be a major part of it, that economic idea. How are we going to establish our economy? And in some South American countries, Central American countries, they do okay with this. And, you may be able to kind of see that with like when we talk about in last year, when we were looking at the war with Argentina, we looked at how the 20th century played out for them economically. They're very much, kind of at the high point of that. Colombia had a very strong economy for a long time. Mexico is considered one of the more wealthy Central South American states. But when we get into some others like Uruguay, Paraguay, get into Venezuela, sometimes, with Cuba and a lot of their changes economically, when we start looking at a lot of the Central South American countries, there are some differences that occur. And some of that has to do with those who manage to kind of diversify and change their economies versus the ones who continue to maintain this kind of commodity type of economic means, and they get kind of manipulated by European powers or even the United States eventually when we get into the 1800s. All right, and then the last part here are the political changes. I just gave some examples. First, there is the Mexican Revolution towards independence that happens in the early 1800s. There's a couple of them that happen in Mexico. That's why there's always that argument behind what is Cinco de Mayo versus what is the actual independence. I don't know if anybody saw the memes that came out on that of like September 16th when people were saying, well, this is the actual day of Mexican independence, which is referred to as the Grito de Dolores, or the Cry of Dolores, which was led initially by this priest, Father Miguel Hidalgo, and we're going to actually study that a little bit more next week. The name Toussaint Louverture, have you guys ever heard of Toussaint Louverture before? So he was the Haitian leader of the first and only slave revolution that led to independence against France. It was a victorious and also very, very brutal and violent slave revolution, and became so impactful it actually got Thomas Jefferson to completely delete and prevent and censor any news of this coming to the United States, because he was fearful that if news spread into North America, it would lead to slave revolts in the United States. And then another name here, which becomes a big part of a lot of the independence, is Joseph Bonaparte. So if you know anything about 19th century history in Europe, basically Napoleon tries to take over Europe. And in doing so, he takes over Spain and he puts his brother in charge. And when that happens, that's a major political reason that there's independence throughout South America and the Caribbean. Because more or less whatever Creole allegiance there was to Spain, it ends when this French guy, who even in the end Napoleon didn't like, they all start becoming independent, and they start saying that they will no longer follow this more or less fake king of Spain. It would have been the equivalent of like during the Revolution, all of a sudden King George was taken over by another country, and basically the British colonists say, well, we're not going to follow King George anymore. So this is kind of a unique piece of the puzzle that plays in politically, but we see kind of a very impactful change as a result of this. Where eventually in the 1800s, as we progress, and Mexico is probably the largest country where you see an impact, but then in what will be called Gran Colombia, under the leadership of Simón Bolivar, there's a move towards independence to create a unified South America, but that all kinds of falls apart, and we'll kind of look at that a little bit more as well. All right, so that's pretty much kind of the main big pieces that we're going to look at. So I just kind of present this because you have some reading that you're going to do today, the 2 chapters in The Born in Blood, and some questions to answer. So these are some key notes and ideas that I want you to follow and pay attention to. All right, so I'm going to stop.